November 19, 1942, 7:30 a.m., southwest of Stalingrad. General Friedrich Paulus stood in his command post studying reconnaissance reports that made no sense. Soviet forces were massing north and south of the city in unprecedented concentrations. Artillery, armor, infantry divisions pulled from across the Eastern Front. The buildup had been detected for weeks, but German intelligence insisted these were defensive preparations, nothing more. Then at 7:30 precisely, the world exploded. Soviet artillery, over 3,500 guns, opened fire simultaneously across a front spanning hundreds of miles. The barrage was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. Not the scattered fire of desperate defense, but coordinated, overwhelming, systematic destruction. Romanian positions north of Stalingrad, held by troops with obsolete equipment and declining morale, began disintegrating within minutes. By 8:50 a.m., Soviet tanks were pouring through gaps in the Romanian lines. T-34s and KV-1s, hundreds of them supported by infantry in seemingly endless waves. The Romanian Third Army, tasked with holding the northern flank of Sixth Army's position around Stalingrad, was collapsing. And to the south, reports indicated identical attacks against Romanian Fourth Army. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't a local counterattack. This was encirclement. Paulus faced a decision that would determine the fate of over 250,000 German soldiers. His Sixth Army was deep inside Stalingrad, engaged in brutal street fighting. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and now threatened with being cut off hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. He could order immediate withdrawal, abandoning Stalingrad but saving his army. Or he could hold position, trust that reinforcements would break the Soviet offensive, and continue the mission Hitler had demanded: take Stalingrad at any cost. The decision Paulus made, and the 72 hours that followed, would doom Nazi Germany's campaign in the East. Not through a single dramatic defeat, but through a cascade of failures, miscalculations, and institutional paralysis that transformed a tactical crisis into strategic catastrophe. This is the story of how 3 days sealed the fate of an army, ended German offensive capability in the East, and began the long retreat to Berlin. To understand November 1942, you must understand how Germany arrived at this moment. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had been predicated on destroying the Soviet Union in a single campaign season. The plan failed. Soviet resistance, despite catastrophic losses, never collapsed. Winter arrived with German forces exhausted and overextended. The dream of quick victory died in the snow outside Moscow. Summer 1942 brought renewed German offensive operations, but with drastically reduced scope. Germany couldn't attack along the entire Eastern Front simultaneously. The focus shifted south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler believed oil was the key. Germany's synthetic fuel production couldn't sustain prolonged war. Soviet oil, if captured, would fuel the Wehrmacht. If denied to the Soviets, it would cripple the Red Army. The plan for Case Blue, as the summer offensive was designated, called for Army Group South to drive toward the Caucasus while protecting its northern flank along the Don River. Stalingrad, an industrial city on the Volga River, was initially a secondary objective. Its capture would secure communications and prevent Soviet counterattacks from the east. But as the offensive progressed, Stalingrad assumed psychological importance far beyond its strategic value. Stalin had named the city after himself in 1925. Hitler became obsessed with its capture. Taking the city bearing Stalin's name would deliver a propaganda victory that transcended military logic. Both dictators poured resources into the battle. What began as a calculated operation devolved into attritional warfare where prestige outweighed strategic sense. By September 1942, German forces had reached Stalingrad. What followed was urban combat of unprecedented intensity. Every building became a fortress, every street a killing ground. German soldiers, trained for mobile warfare, found themselves fighting room to room, floor by floor, in ruins that negated their advantages in armor and artillery. The Luftwaffe reduced much of the city to rubble, inadvertently creating defensive terrain that favored determined defenders. Soviet casualties were catastrophic, but reinforcements kept arriving. Across the Volga, under constant air attack, supplies and troops flowed into the city. Soviet commanders accepted losses that would have broken other armies. Individual soldiers were given life expectancies measured in hours. Entire battalions were consumed in days, but the city held. Barely. By November, German forces controlled perhaps 90% of Stalingrad. But that final 10% remained stubbornly Soviet. While attention focused on the city, Soviet commanders were planning something unprecedented. General Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most trusted military mind, recognized that German obsession with Stalingrad created opportunity. Sixth Army was extended deep into Soviet territory, its flanks held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies with inferior equipment and questionable morale. These satellite forces were necessary because Germany lacked manpower to hold such extended positions alone. Zhukov proposed Operation Uranus, a double envelopment that would cut off Sixth Army completely. Soviet forces would strike north and south of Stalingrad simultaneously, break through the weakly held flanks, and link up behind the German positions. It was ambitious, requiring coordination between multiple army groups, precise timing, and concentration of forces that had to be hidden from German reconnaissance. The Soviets used every deception technique they possessed. Troop movements occurred at night. Radio discipline was absolute. Fake radio traffic suggested defensive preparations. Tank formations were hidden in forests and ravines. Artillery was brought forward only at the last moment. The Germans detected a buildup, but underestimated its scale and purpose. German intelligence, suffering from both Soviet deception and their own institutional arrogance, concluded the Soviets lacked the capability for major offensive operations. This intelligence failure was catastrophic. By mid-November 1942, the Soviets had concentrated over 1 million men, 13,500 guns, 900 tanks, and 1,100 aircraft for Operation Uranus. German forces in the region numbered perhaps 750,000, but most were engaged in Stalingrad or dispersed along the flanks. The correlation of forces at the breakthrough points would be overwhelmingly Soviet. German commanders on the ground saw the danger. General Ferdinand Heim, commanding the 48th Panzer Corps in reserve behind Romanian Third Army, sent increasingly desperate warnings. The Romanians couldn't hold if seriously attacked. The reserve forces were inadequate. A major Soviet offensive would break through. These warnings reached Paulus, reached Army Group headquarters, reached Berlin. They were dismissed. Hitler had declared Stalingrad would be taken. The offensive would continue. November 19th dawned cold and foggy. Visibility was poor, grounding the Luftwaffe. The Soviet plan exploited this. The weather forecast had been integrated into operational planning. At 7:30 a.m. the barrage began. For 80 minutes, Soviet artillery pounded Romanian positions. The Romanians, many equipped with horse-drawn transport and weapons from the 1930s, had no answer. Their positions were obliterated. Communications collapsed. Officers lost contact with subordinate units. Panic spread. At 8:50 a.m., Soviet armor attacked. The Romanian Third Army's front was 90 miles wide, held by forces adequate for quiet sectors but wholly insufficient against major assault. Soviet tanks appeared from the fog in overwhelming numbers. Romanian anti-tank guns, inadequate against modern armor, fired desperately. Some Soviet tanks were damaged or destroyed, but the mass kept coming. German reserves counterattacked piecemeal. The 48th Panzer Corps, cobbled together from various units, moved forward but lacked the strength to stop the Soviet advance. Individual German units fought effectively, destroying Soviet tanks and slowing the breakthrough, but they couldn't restore the line. By midday, Soviet forces had advanced over 20 miles. The Romanian Third Army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent force. To the south at 10:00 a.m. the pattern repeated. Soviet artillery struck Romanian Fourth Army. The barrage was equally devastating. When Soviet tanks attacked at 11:00 a.m., Romanian positions collapsed. The southern pincer of the encirclement was in motion. Two separate Soviet attacks, coordinated across hundreds of miles, were converging on a single objective, the town of Kalach, 50 miles west of Stalingrad. At 6th Army headquarters, Paulus and his staff finally understood. This wasn't a local attack. It was operational-level warfare designed to trap the entire army. The question was what to do. Paulus had authority to conduct tactical operations, but needed permission for strategic decisions like abandoning Stalingrad. He immediately radioed Army Group headquarters, requesting freedom to withdraw westward before the encirclement closed. The request went up the chain of command. From Army Group to OKH, the Army High Command. From OKH to Hitler's headquarters. Each level added delay. Each level added their opinion. Officers who had never seen Stalingrad made judgments about its defensibility. Staff officers in comfortable offices decided the fate of men dying in frozen ruins. November 20th brought intensifying crisis. Soviet spearheads advanced 30 miles, then 40. German counterattacks were local, uncoordinated, insufficient. The Romanian armies had disintegrated. Hungarian and Italian forces, watching Romanian collapse, began showing signs of panic. If the line broke there too, the entire southern front would collapse. Paulus received permission to pull some forces back from Stalingrad to form a defensive perimeter, but he was explicitly forbidden from abandoning the city. This compromise satisfied neither military necessity nor operational reality. Forces pulled from Stalingrad weakened the assault. Forces held in Stalingrad couldn't reinforce the flanks. The worst possible solution to a crisis that demanded clarity. By November 21st, Soviet pincers were approaching Kalach. German forces in the area fought desperately to keep escape routes open, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Soviet commanders pushed their forces ruthlessly. Tank crews fought without sleep. Infantry marched until they collapsed, then marched further. The Soviet concept of deep operations emphasized momentum. Once breakthrough achieved, exploitation forces drove deep, bypassing resistance, spreading chaos. At 4:00 p.m. on November 22nd, Soviet forces from north and south met at Kalach. The encirclement was complete. 6th Army, most of 4th Panzer Army, portions of Romanian forces, over 250,000 men, were trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles east to west and 25 miles north to south. The largest encirclement in military history had been achieved in 72 hours. The immediate question was whether encirclement meant destruction. Paulus still had a powerful force. His units retained cohesion. They had ammunition and some supplies. A breakout attempt, if launched immediately, might succeed. The Soviet encirclement was thin in places. Concentrated German attack could potentially rupture it. This was the moment when everything hung in balance. The decision made in the next hours would determine whether 6th Army survived as a fighting force or died in the Russian winter. Paulus wanted to break out. His corps commanders wanted to break out. Every officer who understood the tactical situation knew that staying in the pocket was suicidal. But Hitler forbade it. The order came directly from Führer headquarters. 6th Army would hold Stalingrad. Supplies would be delivered by air. A relief force would break through from outside. The pocket would become a fortress. German soldiers would not abandon ground once taken. This was not military judgment. This was ideology masquerading as strategy. The decision rested on Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could supply 6th Army by air. Göring, desperate to restore his damaged prestige, assured Hitler that delivering 500 tons of supplies daily was feasible. Luftwaffe logistics officers, who actually understood airlift capacity, knew it was impossible, but they weren't asked. Goering promised. Hitler believed. Paulus was ordered to hold. The airlift began almost immediately. German transport aircraft, primarily Ju-52 trimotors, flew from bases west of the pocket into makeshift airstrips within the encirclement. Soviet fighters hunted them. Soviet anti-aircraft artillery surrounded the pocket. Winter weather grounded flights for days. The maximum the Luftwaffe ever delivered was 300 tons in a single day. Most days brought far less. The promised 500 tons daily never materialized. Sixth Army began dying slowly. Rations were cut, then cut again. Horses were slaughtered for food. Then the horses were gone. Soldiers existed on bread and thin soup. Men weakened from malnutrition became susceptible to disease. Typhus spread. Dysentery killed men already weakened by starvation. Frostbite claimed limbs from soldiers without adequate winter clothing. The medical situation became nightmarish. Casualties couldn't be evacuated. The wounded lay in unheated bunkers without adequate medical supplies. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia. Men died from wounds that would have been treatable with proper facilities. The ratio of wounded to killed reversed normal patterns. Usually, 3 men wounded for each killed. In Stalingrad's pocket, wounded lingered, suffering, dying slowly. Meanwhile, German military leadership planned relief operations. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, Germany's most capable operational commander, was given command of the newly created Army Group Don. His mission: break through to Stalingrad, re-establish land communications, enable Sixth Army's survival or withdrawal. Manstein gathered forces from across the Eastern Front. Divisions were pulled from quieter sectors. The 6th Panzer Division was rushed from France. Every available tank was concentrated. By early December, Manstein had assembled a relief force strong enough to attempt breakthrough. Operation Winter Storm would attack from the southwest, driving toward the pocket along the shortest route. The operation began December 12th. German forces initially made good progress against Soviet defenses that were still developing. The first day brought advances of 15 miles. Soviet reserves rushed to the threatened sector. The relief force pushed forward, taking heavy casualties but maintaining momentum. Within days, they were 30 miles from the pocket's perimeter. This was the last moment when Sixth Army might have been saved. If Paulus launched a breakout toward the relief force, the two groups might link up. Together, they could fight their way west. Manstein urged this course. He signaled Paulus that Winter Storm was the last chance: break out or die. But Paulus refused to disobey Hitler's orders without explicit permission, and Hitler still forbade abandonment of Stalingrad. The moment passed. Soviet forces launched their own counteroffensive, Operation Little Saturn, attacking Italian positions on the Don River. The Italian Eighth Army collapsed. Suddenly, Manstein faced encirclement of his own relief force. On December 23rd, he ordered withdrawal. The relief attempt had failed. Sixth Army was abandoned to its fate. January 1943 brought the final agony. Soviet forces compressed the pocket systematically. Artillery bombarded German positions constantly. Attacks came from all directions. The Luftwaffe airlift was reduced to a trickle as airfields fell. Paulus received a final order from Hitler: fight to the last man, last bullet. Surrender was forbidden. The soldiers of Sixth Army would die as martyrs holding Soviet forces that could otherwise attack elsewhere. Reality didn't match ideology. German soldiers, starving and freezing, began surrendering in groups when Soviet forces overran positions. The pocket was split on January 25th. Individual resistance pockets held out briefly, then collapsed. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered his headquarters. Hitler had promoted him to field marshal the day before, a calculated gesture implying that German field marshals never surrendered. Paulus understood the message and ignored it. The final German positions surrendered February 2, 1943. Of the 250,000 men encircled, approximately 90,000 entered Soviet captivity. Most were wounded, sick, or starving. Only about 5,000 would eventually return to Germany, many not until the 1950s. The remainder died in the pocket or in captivity from wounds, disease, and the brutal conditions of Soviet POW camps. The strategic implications were immediate and catastrophic for Germany. An entire field army, the Wehrmacht's largest formation, had been destroyed. 22 divisions effectively ceased to exist. Germany's 1942 summer offensive achievements were nullified. The front line moved hundreds of miles west. Army Group A in the Caucasus faced encirclement and had to withdraw. All gains from Case Blue were abandoned. The psychological impact was equally significant. Stalingrad was Germany's first major acknowledged defeat. The Reich's propaganda machine had proclaimed victory imminent. Now they announced catastrophe. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility shattered. German civilians who had believed victory was certain understood for the first time that Germany might lose. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was validation. The Red Army had conducted successful operational-level warfare against the Wehrmacht. Soviet commanders demonstrated they could plan and execute complex operations. Soviet soldiers proved they could defeat German forces in set-piece battles. The psychological boost was enormous. If Germany could be beaten at Stalingrad, it could be beaten everywhere. The military balance shifted permanently. Germany lost initiative it never regained. Every subsequent major operation in the East was reactive, responding to Soviet attacks rather than imposing German will. The vast offensives of 1941 and 1942 were over. From 1943 forward, Germany fought defensive campaigns interrupted by local counterattacks. The human cost was staggering. Soviet casualties in the Stalingrad area from July 1942 to February 1943 exceeded 1 million. German and Axis casualties approached 850,000. For perspective, American casualties for the entire war in all theaters totaled about 400,000. Stalingrad alone consumed twice that many Axis forces. But the casualty exchange favored the Soviets strategically. Soviet manpower reserves, while not infinite, could sustain such losses. Germany's couldn't. Every division destroyed at Stalingrad was irreplaceable. The Wehrmacht would continue fighting for 2 more years, but it would never regain 1942 strength. The political ramifications extended beyond the Eastern Front. Neutral nations watching the war reassessed German prospects. Turkey, which had considered joining the Axis, remained neutral. Spain's Franco, despite ideological sympathy, refused German requests for more active support. Sweden continued selling iron ore to Germany but increased covert support for the Allies. The aura of German invincibility had been punctured. Within Germany, the defeat prompted the first significant internal doubts. The White Rose resistance group distributed pamphlets citing Stalingrad as proof of Hitler's incompetence. Goebbels gave his famous Total War speech in February 1943, calling for complete mobilization. The speech implicitly acknowledged that Germany faced potential defeat, a remarkable admission after years of promised victory. The operational lessons were profound. The Wehrmacht's institutional culture emphasized tactical excellence but struggled with operational-level decision-making when Hitler controlled strategy. German commanders understood what needed to be done at Stalingrad but lacked authority to act. The command structure that worked in victory became paralysis in crisis. Soviet operations showed dramatic improvement. The Red Army of 1942 bore little resemblance to the force that nearly collapsed in 1941. Better training, improved equipment, commanders who had survived the purges and learned from mistakes. Most importantly, Stalin had learned to delegate operational decisions to professionals. Zhukov and other commanders had freedom to plan and execute operations. This trust in military professionals was something Hitler never granted his generals. The logistical lessons were equally clear. Germany's logistics system couldn't support extended operations deep in Soviet territory. The Wehrmacht advanced faster than supply lines could follow. When crisis struck, there were no reserves, no strategic depth, no flexibility. The Soviets, fighting on internal lines with shortened supply routes, could concentrate forces faster than Germany could respond. The encirclement success validated deep operations theory that Soviet military thinkers had developed in the 1930s. Break through at weak points, drive deep with mobile forces, encircle enemy concentrations, destroy them methodically. This operational template would be repeated across the Eastern Front. Subsequent Soviet offensives followed the Stalingrad model: massive artillery preparation, breakthrough at weak sectors, exploitation with armor, encirclement of German forces. Germany tried to adapt but never successfully countered this operational approach. Elastic defense, mobile reserves, tactical withdrawals to prepared positions, all were attempted, but Germany lacked the manpower and material to implement these doctrines at necessary scale. Each defensive success was temporary. Each withdrawal surrendered territory. The long retreat westward became inevitable. The 72 hours from November 19th to 22nd were critical because they represented Germany's last moment when the situation might have been salvaged. Had Paulus received immediate permission to withdraw on November 19th, most of 6th Army could have escaped. Had the encirclement been broken during formation, when Soviet positions were weak, the outcome would have differed. Had Hitler prioritized saving the army over holding symbolic ground, catastrophe might have been averted. But none of these decisions were made. Institutional paralysis, ideological rigidity, and Hitler's personal obsession with never yielding ground combined to ensure the worst possible outcome. The 72 hours of encirclement became 75 days of dying. What could have been a successful withdrawal became the greatest military disaster in German history. The broader strategic picture shows Stalingrad as the pivot point of the Eastern Front. Before Stalingrad, Germany could still conceive of victory, or at least favorable stalemate. After Stalingrad, the only question was how long Germany could delay defeat. The Red Army would continue advancing, with temporary setbacks but inexorable momentum, until reaching Berlin in May 1945. For individual soldiers, the experience was trauma that haunted survivors forever. Interviews with Stalingrad veterans, German and Soviet, reveal men permanently marked by what they witnessed. The cold, the hunger, the casual brutality, the sight of friends dying from wounds or starvation. Many survivors never spoke of their experiences, unable to articulate what they'd endured. The city of Stalingrad itself was destroyed so completely that post-war reconstruction essentially built a new city on the ruins. Renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization, the city today contains numerous memorials to the battle. The Mamiev-Kurgan Memorial Complex, featuring the massive Motherland Call statue, dominates the skyline. Tourists walk through preserved battle sites, trying to imagine the fighting that consumed the city. In Germany, Stalingrad became shorthand for catastrophic defeat. The word entered language as metaphor for any situation of hopeless entrapment. Politicians avoided foreign policy adventures by warning, "We don't want another Stalingrad." Military planners studied the battle obsessively, extracting lessons about what to avoid. The trauma shaped German strategic culture for generations. In Russia, Stalingrad became the symbol of Soviet determination and sacrifice. The city's defenders were celebrated as heroes. The victory demonstrated that Soviet people could endure any hardship and overcome any enemy. This narrative served Soviet propaganda for decades, though it simplified complex reality into heroic myth. The historical assessment has evolved over decades. Early accounts, influenced by German generals' memoirs, often blamed Hitler exclusively while portraying Wehrmacht commanders as brilliant professionals hamstrung by ideological interference. This narrative was self-serving, but contained truth. Hitler's strategic decisions were catastrophic, but German commanders shared responsibility for implementing flawed strategies and failing to resign rather than execute suicidal orders. Soviet historiography celebrated the victory while minimizing costs. Casualty figures were secret for decades. The incompetence and brutality of early war Soviet leadership was obscured. Only after the Soviet Union's collapse did fuller accounting become possible. The emerging picture shows Soviet victory built on staggering sacrifice, operational competence developed through bitter experience, and leadership that accepted horrific losses as necessary costs. Modern analysis emphasizes the battle's operational and strategic dimension while acknowledging the human cost. Stalingrad was decisive not because of a single brilliant maneuver, but because it represented the intersection of multiple factors. Soviet industrial production outpaced Germany's. Soviet manpower reserves were larger. Soviet operational art matured. German logistics reached breaking points. German leadership made critical errors. All these factors converged at Stalingrad. The counterfactual questions are endless. What if Germany had bypassed Stalingrad instead of attacking it directly? What if Hitler had permitted withdrawal when encirclement threatened? What if the Luftwaffe had accurately assessed airlift capacity? What if Paulus had disobeyed orders and broken out? Each question reveals decision points where different choices might have changed outcomes. But the fundamental strategic reality was this: Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against the Soviet Union. Soviet population was larger. Soviet industrial capacity, once relocated beyond German reach, exceeded German production. Soviet allies, particularly the United States, provided resources Germany couldn't match. Stalingrad didn't create these imbalances. It revealed them. The 72 hours of encirclement accelerated processes already underway. Germany was overextended, undersupplied, and facing enemies growing stronger while German strength peaked. Stalingrad transformed gradual strategic decline into acute crisis. The defeat couldn't be concealed or minimized. Its implications couldn't be ignored. After Stalingrad, everyone understood the war's trajectory had changed. In the final analysis, those 72 hours mattered because they represented the moment when German defeat in the East became inevitable. Not certain in timing or specific form, but inevitable in direction. The Wehrmacht would fight on for over 2 more years. It would win tactical victories. It would inflict enormous casualties, but it would never regain strategic initiative. From November 1942 forward, the question wasn't whether Germany would lose in the East, but when and how completely. The soldiers trapped in Stalingrad's pocket didn't know they were dying for a cause already lost. They fought because they were soldiers, because their comrades depended on them, because surrender meant Soviet captivity and probable death. Their courage and suffering were real, but their sacrifice achieved nothing except buying time for a regime that would fall regardless. The 72 hours that doomed Nazi Germany weren't dramatic in the way Hollywood depicts battles. There was no single moment of decision, no climactic confrontation, just a series of Soviet attacks, collapsing Allied positions, advancing tank columns, and German leadership paralyzed by ideology and institutional dysfunction. The encirclement closed not with a bang, but with Soviet patrols meeting on a bridge and shaking hands, while 250,000 German soldiers realized they were trapped. Those soldiers had time to understand what had happened. Over the next 75 days, as they slowly died, they knew their leaders had abandoned them. They knew the promises of relief were lies. They knew Hitler valued Stalingrad's symbolism more than their lives. And they knew that when they died, Germany's chances of winning died with them. The 72 hours of encirclement weren't just tactical defeat. They were the moment Nazi Germany's eastern ambitions died in the Russian winter, exactly where Napoleon's had died 130 years before.